All right, thank you, everyone. Hopefully, we'll make this interesting for the folks who are here. And yeah, like Sunil said, my name is Prasads Journey. My Twitter handle is @Prasads Journey. If you like the talk, tweet about it. If you don't. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about enterprise product do's and don'ts, learnings from marketplaces. I know that, as he said, we're an hour away from drinks, so hold on to your hats. You will get there soon enough. I'll start with a little bit background about myself. So I have a couple of engineering degrees, one from India and one from UC Berkeley. I did an MBA from Harvard, and I started my business career at Bain & Company as a strategy consultant. And if any of you is thinking about consulting as a precursor or as a thing to do during your careers, feel free to touch base with me. I mean, I think there's much to recommend about it. There are things that I did at Bain that I use every day. And then mostly since then, I've been doing product management. I started my career in product management at Siebel Systems, doing call center work. Went to Oracle with the acquisition. From there, I moved to LinkedIn, where I was product lead for LinkedIn Recruiter. I think you guys might know this, but LinkedIn makes most of its money through talent solutions, and Recruiter is the flagship monetization product. So we grew it from a V1 product to a $1 billion plus product line. So it's a great ride there for 7 years. I was head of product at OpenTable, the restaurant reservation platform, for a couple of years. And most recently, I've been head of product at an e-commerce startup called Signified, which is in the fraud prevention space. Now, if you look at that trend over there, there's some trends you're going to see, as Sunil alluded to, and that is that my journey has taken me from B2B to B2B to B2B, B2C, now back to B2B. And it's kind of funny because just a few weeks ago, I did a talk for Products That Count on product management learnings from classical mythology. I'm going to try something different, and you can go to their website or check, Google my name, and you'll find the presentation. And one of the things we discussed in that presentation was the hero's journey. How many folks here have heard of the hero's journey? So a fair number. For the folks who haven't, basically Joseph Campbell was a writer from the 20th century who wrote a lot about the hero's journey. And the concept basically underpins pretty much any saga that you read about, whether mythological all the way through Star Wars and everything in between. And the story is about a hero, and he or she is comfortable in their known world, and at some point there's a call to adventure, and they move from that known world into an unknown world where they have challenges and temptations. They unfortunately fall into an abyss. That's the worst part of it. Transform themselves, atone for themselves, and then come back triumphant as heroes. I was thinking of my career journey, and I was like, not to oversell myself, but I have been on the hero's journey, and that's me up front, like with a stake walking. I started my career at Siebel Enterprise Software, learned that business, was there for 6-7 years, went to Oracle, and that was a comfortable place. Then I decided to leave the Shire, and move over to LinkedIn. It was a little bit, challenging, daunting, tempting as well. I didn't actually fall into the abyss, thank goodness, but close enough a number of times. In my process of transformation, went to OpenTable, and in these businesses, in both businesses, I was involved on the enterprise side, the B2B side, but also the consumer side. So I got a chance to see both, and then finally atoned for myself, and I'm back in B2B. So this is a nice little cycle here. Who knows what's next? Maybe I'll start the cycle all over again because it was fun. And the interesting thing about the hero's journey is that the hero returning has adventures and takeaways for his tribe when he comes back, or her tribe when she comes back. And that's my goal here today. You're my tribe for the day, and I'll be sharing with you some do's and don'ts for enterprise products from my marketplace experience. And a couple of quick housekeeping items just in terms of what we're doing here. The first is that, as you've seen from the slides, no designers were harmed in the making of this deck. They will be once they've seen the deck, but at least in the making of it, everyone was safe. The second is, this is all a matter of perspective, right? The do's and don'ts is very binary. Don't do this, do this. You may disagree. I've got the podium, so my thing goes for the time being, but let's discuss it if you disagree in our question and answers. And the last thing is, the way I've set these up is there's do's and a countervailing don't, because not everything from the B2C world is applicable in the B2B world. So let's just keep that in mind. And to start, the very first one is, do invest in a modern UX for enterprise apps. in the very last session, we had Melissa talking about how enterprise is anti-design, right? And actually, that's true. I mean, I think when I started my career, like a couple of years ago, no, much further than that, this is what we used to build. It's a classic enterprise UI. It's a sequence of list applets, form applets, and fields. And if you needed to add functionality, you simply add another list applet, or form applet, or field, and the user will keep scrolling, and they'll scroll and scroll forever, and that's fine. Luckily, most of the scrolling was vertical scrolling. You will not believe it. There are some apps which will make you horizontally scroll, and I'm like, really? Really? This is so terrible. And what's really interesting for me is this, what this look reminds me of? How many of you remember writing out RFPs or doing Gartner Magic Quadrants? It's basically, it looks something like this, right? There's this requirements document, and you take the requirements, every new requirement, and you just make a new field out of it. And that's how you solve those problems. And it was amazing. It was like just basically UX. I don't think when I started my career, I don't think we had designers. It was mostly product people trying to act as designers, and look where that got us. So this worked for a while. Interestingly enough, you do see some of this kind of UI even today, and in some cases it still might make sense. But I'm going to make the case that enterprise, like Melissa said, should no longer be an anti-design. What I learned in the marketplace business in particular, which was important, is that the users on the B2B side are often also users on the consumer side. And so if you end up with like deliberately designing crappy UI for them on one side, it's going to be a very jarring experience because they're on LinkedIn Recruiter, but they're also on LinkedIn.com. They don't look anything the same. There's no brand consistency. There's no UI consistency. People just won't take it anymore. That's one big reason that you want to sort of make sure that you have good UI across the board. But also the reality is people are used to using modern apps, Facebook, Twitter, Mint, many others, where UI is a given, and they will not accept anymore that you have bad UI as a matter of course, right? And the way it reflects is, dissatisfaction with the job and looking, basically being disengaged. And so with that in mind, a couple of UI screenshots. And so, this is from Recruiter, from a version of Recruiter from the time I was there. As you can see, it's more visually appealing. We did spend some time making it so that it's not just a collection of applets, but there are numbers at the top. There's very clean and easy to use drop downs. You have a bit of a feed. You have some alerts on the right hand side. So more visually appealing. And the second thing on the right hand side, what I have is that's an open table app on the restaurant side. So restaurants have to manage their tables. This is a version which we use to manage the tables on an iPad. And what's cool is we have a version of this which works on the web, and we have a version of this which works on the iPhone. And what we didn't do, was we attempted to do this, but we didn't. We didn't say we're going to use one single app across all of them, because just imagine trying to do table management. This is basically a table management layout, right, where you have different tables and you can see parties coming in. Just imagine trying to do that on a 5-inch phone. It just won't work. So what you try to do is like we discussed in the previous session, what is the user persona? The person using the iPad is at the host stand. They need something like that. The person using the iPhone app is an owner. They need something quite different. They probably don't need this level of complexity. So adjust to the form factor. So these are among the changes that we did. And basically at this point, I will not work at a company which doesn't give enough focus on the UX, because it's going to result in frustration down the road. However, there is a don't attached to this. And the don't is don't over optimize for aesthetics over utility. And because you can go too much the other way as well. I think one of the key things to keep in mind is people use these products to do their jobs. And I'll give you an example here. This is, the left-hand side is a version of Recruiter, a previous version. This is probably circa 2010, so some time ago. It's a profile of a person. I've hidden their name. I've hidden their details because, I don't want them calling me afterwards and saying, well, why is my name up there? And you can see over there to the top right, it has profile actions. It says add to clipboard, save to project, print to PDF. So it had different actions to do all these things. This is the newer version. I'm sorry it's a little blurry. It's very hard to extract you screenshots from 8 years ago and make sure they're all perfect. But what we did over here was we have a little button over there which says save profiles. So that save profiles button has save to projects, add to clipboard, etc. It's much cleaner. The UI is much cleaner because you don't have that many buttons. And we launched it and we were like, this is so awesome. It looks so beautiful. And we had an immediate backlash and everyone hated it, right? And the reason was, well, number one, many of them couldn't find it. So we had a lot of tickets saying, where's add to clipboard? Where's my add to clipboard? And when people did find it, what we also heard was that it was more clicks, and you might not think it's a big deal, but we discovered there are some people who actually added to clipboard 300 times a day, that many times. So you're adding 300 clicks to their day. And so we made adjustments, and we didn't completely go back to the old UI, but you can keep in mind that if it's such a high utility thing, the ultimate answer ended up being, we looked at what were the most frequently used actions, and we made sure those were up there, and we hid some of the other ones. So that's the right way to go about it. So that's number one. Invest in modern UX, but don't optimize for aesthetics over utility. Number two, I'm going to start with a don't, just to make sure you're all awake. Just flip it around a little bit. The don't is, don't just build workflow tools. Back in the day, again, forms, applets, etc. And all you're doing was the enterprise apps were data capture and workflow, data capture and workflow. And what that really meant was you really didn't have much of a differentiation from the next player who came along and did data capture and workflow. And the way that enterprise apps typically try to get sticky was they would do customization. You get a system integrator come in and spend $2 million to customize it, and that made it sticky. But it also resulted in like a lot of implementation costs. But also people got really frustrated. I mean, users of these old-time enterprise apps just hate them. Just hate them with a vengeance. But they can't do anything about them. I don't think that's the right way you want to build product. You don't want the product to be there because they have no options. That seems like we could do better with our lives, right? So my suggestion here is the do, on the flip side of the don't, is do leverage personalization and data to differentiate your offerings. And I'll walk through a couple of screenshots here so it's clear. This is a version of Recruiter, again, LinkedIn Recruiter. And here what we did was, instead of just showing them profiles, people's profiles, we also added some talent analytics on the top. So you're looking for people of a certain profile. Which schools did they go to? Which regions are they in? What companies have they previously worked at? That's all available as data that is useful in helping you refine your search further. So it's not just a question of just showing them some matches. It was also going beyond that. This is from OpenTable. Here we're showing them where network covers come from. And typically it's how many people are we sending you, how many are coming through our partner network, and what are the lead times for reservations. So an operational insight. And the last two are from my work at Signify, my team's work at Signified, which is around approval rates for e-commerce orders, chargeback rates, etc. What we tell them there is what's your average approval rate and what are the average approval rates, for example, for similar merchants. Now, you might say that if you have a marketplace business like a LinkedIn or an OpenTable, they have an advantage that they have a consumer network to get that data from. And you're right, that's definitely a positive that it's not easy for an enterprise business to bring up. Having said that, I feel like that's a cop-out as well. And the reason is because you can always bring operational insights. How are you doing against yourself? Like if your approval rate was 95% this month, is that higher or lower than it was 3 months ago? You don't need third-party or consumer data for that. You can easily give them operational insights. You can give them benchmark insights, right? Which is how are you doing against your neighbors? Most companies love this kind of data, right? Which is, tell me, am I performing as my neighborhood, as well as my neighborhood is? If you're a restaurant, for example, on OpenTable, and you have worse business than you expected, is it because the economy is slow, or is it because I'm not performing well? I want that data. And we have that data. You can provide that to customers. So I don't believe that you can say that non-marketplaces don't have data. You do, just have to figure out ways to share it in ways which maintain privacy but also deliver value. That was number two. See, number three is ship on a frequent cadence. Do ship on a frequent cadence. I got this off the internet. The internet's so useful for stuff like this. I was like, I can draw a picture like this, but someone's already probably done it, so I did. So thank you, Alex Searcy from Waydev. But like in the 90s, I don't know if any of you have worked on waterfall. I have. I am that young. I've actually worked on waterfall, and when we used to, in those days, it was like a long process, one team handing off to the other, and if you shipped every 18 months, that was pretty good, And if you shipped once a year, you're like, that is awesomely fast. It was lightning fast back in those days because it was all one long process. Now you move to nowadays, you have the technologies, the agile processes. You've got so many ways to actually ship quickly that many of the companies I worked in can launch daily. You can do a daily launch if you wish, right? I mean, that's how fast it's become, and that's why people do expect you to, be responsive, have shipping, have the shipping of product happen frequently, and you should totally move away from that old model of shipping every 18 months. Having said that, there is, as you know, there's going to be a don't attached to the do, and the don't is don't ship so rapidly that your users' heads spin. And just to cut you off there, users' head spinning is a metric that we use, okay? Like how fast the head spins. If you let them spin once, that's dangerous enough. So don't let them spin at all. And the reason for this is, for most enterprise users, they use it to do work. That's the tool that they use to get stuff done. And they actually have companies will standardize on your latest software, and that's how people work. And if you put something in there, you're actually adversely affecting their productivity. I'll give you an example from my LinkedIn days. I remember flying out to Redmond to meet the folks at Microsoft. This is 4 or 5 years before the acquisition, so no relation between the companies. I'd just gone to see them as a matter of courtesy and get their inputs and requests. And I discovered that there was someone on their staff whose close to full-time job was writing documentation for LinkedIn Recruiter and the way that LinkedIn Recruiter should be used in Microsoft. Full-time. I mean, my mind was blown. I was like, my ego, which is already pretty large, just went, through the roof. I'm like, there's some guy whose whole job it is to write documentation of my product. And then I stepped back for a moment after I came back down to earth, and I was like, but that also means that anytime I change anything major, that person has to not just change it. That's probably good for them because that's job security. But the lead time is a big deal, right? I change it, I launch it on a Monday. They've got a new batch of recruiters on a Monday, and all of a sudden, the documentation doesn't make any sense anymore, right? I mean, this is completely unacceptable to them because that matters. And they got really, and companies like that can get frustrated if you don't give them some lead advance notice. And so, how to manage this dynamic? I don't want to leave it at, well, don't ship too frequently, go back to 18 months. That's not what you want to do. For me, I think the way we used to do it in all the places I worked is you still want to maintain that rapid development ethos, right? You want people to be like, ship, get it ready for shipping. Get it ready for shipping doesn't mean dump it as is on the customers as soon as it's kind of ready, right? That's not what you mean. So you should group the multiple features together, hopefully into something which is thematic. So for example, at LinkedIn, when we worked on this, we would think about improvements to in-mail, all 4 or 5 improvements to in-mail happening at once. So 4 or 5 improvements to the search experience happening at once. Because then you've got a story to tell, and you're not adjusting every single part of the UI at once. You're taking sort of a theme, and it makes more sense for the customer. And then you sort of have a preset cadence, and I had an email thread running with Sunil on this, and what is the right cadence? It really depends. There might be some enterprise cases where you could go as frequently as once every couple of weeks. Your customers may be okay with it. What we found at LinkedIn was it depended. Very small features, you could go with a 2 to 4 week release cycle, but anything material was not more than, you should be looking at like 2 to 3 months for the major releases. Anything more than that becomes challenging. But again, this is not one size fits all. Just be cognizant of the fact that you have an impact on your users. And the second is sign intrepid customers and users up for a beta testing program. They'll get access to new features ahead of time. And there are many customers who want to do this, right? So all of you have probably heard of feature flags or things like that. Put it behind a feature flag so only those customers see it. They're testing it. They're telling you if they're ready or not, and then you can release it to GA. And the last thing I'll call out is invest in go-to-market initiatives. So like this really matters. I had a very strong partnership both at LinkedIn and OpenTable with my product marketing team. And if you do things like, I'll show you a screenshot in a moment of who moved my cheese decks. People get really frustrated when you have a new UI. First of all, any redesign they just hate, right? I mean, this is typical of most of the apps. I'm a product person. I don't mind doing it to other people, changing UIs on them. But when somebody changes for me, I'm like, this is the worst ever. This is, how dare you change my UI? And like 5 days later, I have no recollection of what the old UI looked like. But those 4 or 5 days were the worst days of my life, right? And so if you can help them, you should, right? So here's one example of what we called Who Moved My Cheese. So when we had a new version of Recruiter, we sort of would have decks which had screenshots like this. So the left is what the old UI looked like, and the right is what the new UI looks like, and it's calling out, oh, you used to do editing search that way. Here's the new UI and how you can do it. This is a deck. Obviously, there are ways to do it using Pendo and other, sort of third-party software, or even your own engineers to do it in product as well. But don't forget that, because people care about it. And if you just dump changes on them, they feel like they don't have control. They will hate you for it. So give them a sense of control. Give them a sense of continuity. And just to wrap up, the last is recognizing sales as a key persona and the importance of a deal. What gets really interesting, especially marketplace businesses, is that you get sort of oriented towards a roadmap. I'm going to build this roadmap, and that's all that matters. And if sales comes to you with any asks, you sort of give them the Heisman, right? Saying, oh well, I got my roadmap over here, and that can get really frustrating for salespeople because at the end of the day, your roadmap for end users, for instance, can help get the initial set of users or customers, but you might want to upsell them, and that sales is going to do that. And if you never listen to them, and you say that those deals don't matter, you're going to lose them, and you're going to lose sales, and it's going to be frustrating all around. So the thing I've tried to do there is set aside a little, powder for those requests. They're coming, so instead of immediately saying no, and I get that most product managers, most of our jobs is saying no, so I get that part of it, but instead of immediately knee-jerk saying no, you say, okay, you have 10 requests, here are the 3 that I can do, and so that's one way to handle it. The don't over here is don't abandon any pretense of a roadmap once you have a couple of big customers in the road. You tend to have people go really one end to the other end. It's like, well, I'm not taking any requests at all we've got these 2 customers, and the rest of the quarter is all about those 2 customers, because you're going to put all your eggs in one basket, and you do risk becoming a bespoke shop, right? I mean, all of us are here to build scalable software that can be deployed multiple times over. We're not really here to build custom software, but that's what ends up happening, and that means it'll impact your scalability, it'll impact the valuation of the company, many adverse effects if you let that happen. And so how do you manage that? I'll start with this screenshot I pulled. Mark Suster is a venture capitalist from Southern Cal, from LA. He wrote this article, it looks like 10 years ago, and it's called Most Startups Should Be Deer Hunters. Things have changed since then, but in general, the guidance is good. I mean, like he talks about how you can go after elephants, which are very large customers who will swamp your needs, or you can go after rabbits, which are very small customers who give you $5 a month, right? And then can you get in between that and look for the customers who are not going to be, he describes it like AT&T size, which is the elephants, and not rabbit size as well, and look for them as deer. So that's a worthy article to read. From my point of view, a couple of things I'd call out was it's not easy to solve this problem, let's be clear. I don't want to trivialize it, but you're trying to look for features that matter to multiple customers, right? Are there features that truly matter for multiple customers? Can you group them together thematically again? Can you figure out what the must-haves versus nice-to-haves are? And I've also called out here, it's not just features, it's also enterprise/IT requirements. I remember when I joined LinkedIn, one of the first things I heard was like, well, we have to build this enterprise platform, and it has to have integrations to Active Directory or the directories in the company, otherwise nobody will buy it. And what we discovered was that wasn't necessarily the case. There are many things where you hear from customers that it's totally needed, but if you have enough value in the product otherwise, they will buy it, and they'll wait till you put those features in. And so that sort of connects me to the next item, which is look down the road, right? Sometimes the customers say, I won't buy if you don't have this. But the reality might be that if you say, I will do it in the next 12 months, they'll be okay. You don't have to then subvert your roadmap for the next quarter just to get that customer. So you have some degrees of flexibility, use them. And the last thing I'll call out, this is really important. Like when I went into leadership, product leadership, from being more of a mid-level manager, and didn't realize how much of my time was going to go into this, which is sitting down with my SVP of sales, sitting down with sales leadership, and explaining why we were doing what we were doing, and why we weren't doing certain things that might be important to the sales team. And that brought a lot of credibility, because it was almost like you're giving them some reason for what you're doing. They can counter it, they might have feedback, but at least they have a story of where you're going. I know we're slightly past time, so I'll just wrap up with this single slide. And this is sort of a summary of all of these things. And so, just to summarize, user experience, do invest in a modern enterprise UX, but don't sacrifice utility for aesthetics. Number 2, data. Leverage data and personalization. Don't just make yours a place to just store records. Number 3, shipping cadence. Do it frequently, not too frequently. And number 4, sales and deals. Make sure you do recognize that sales matters and deals matter, but don't let them completely overwhelm your roadmap. So with that, I'm happy to open up for, I think we have a few minutes of questions. Yes, over there.
How do you think about preparing marketing for when you do release code to production, and how do you make sure that that's a good result?
How do you think about marketing?
How far in advance do you let marketing know that you're producing one or two feeds, and then how do you
Yeah. It's a great question. I think having a really good working relationship with marketing matters. So I'll give you an example from how we did it at LinkedIn. At LinkedIn, I had a weekly meeting with the key product managers on our teams and the key product marketers on our team, and we would be looking at some sort of a document which had the next 6 months of things we were working on. And we had a tactic there which we internally used to call 2-2-2. And that was basically, you have to have a very clear understanding of what you're going to do in the next 2 weeks. You better be perfect on 2 weeks. You have to have a fairly good understanding of 2 months, but not down to the date because things can slip. And the next 2 quarters, you have a reasonable understanding where things will go back and forth. And the reason it was useful was because we would take each release and we'd sort of tier it as well and say it's a tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3 release. Tier 3 releases, you'd be lucky to get it on release notes. No, everything goes on release notes, but that's tier 3. Whereas tier 1 has the whole shebang, including PR and collateral and et cetera. So that would give people a sense of, and it's not just a question of release, by the way. The other thing you do with marketing is also plan for market validation upfront, because you might want to talk to customers about, hey, should we be building this product? Will anyone buy it, and how much will they pay for it? And so if you do that, then you sort of have a very clear picture of what's the first thing in the document is something which is very near term, and then a little later than that, and a little later than that. And very often that's where you discover discrepancies in understanding. When the product person thinks, oh, I thought that was going to be a tier 2 release, and marketing says, well, we have the resources to barely have the resource to make it a tier 3 release. And so those meetings can be somewhat contentious, but that's a good way to sort of sort this out. So having them in the loop 6 months in advance is probably the right answer then.
One of the things that you mentioned about was in that data feedback.
Yeah.
With enterprise customers, how do you try to do that? Somebody trying to make this kind of is that with a lot of user interviews, qualitative, or surveys and emails to them? Just how do you try to balance that relationship?
Sorry, can you start with the first part of the question again? I didn't get the full thing.
To get that beta feedback from enterprise customers.
Yeah.
How do you balance that between kind of like having a relationship and asking them and giving that personal attention, versus kind of like in-app surveys or CSAT scores?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think you do both, and I know that's a cop-out answer. Sorry, it's easy to say that. What I'd say is that the customer engagement, you should do deep customer engagements because you get the depth of feedback there. I think that matters. Talking to 10, 20, especially if you have something which is a big honking launch where getting it wrong could be really expensive. I don't just want a check mark saying, oh yeah, that's interesting. I want, would you pay for this, and is this more important than other stuff? Literally, we had a process we used to call market validation, where we would do 90-minute interviews with customers on new products, and it would be very much in depth, and we do it with between 15 and 30 customers, and that was a huge investment of time. But we'd supplement that often with surveys, because surveys will give you 400 or 500, and you just can't go as depth in the surveys. So I think you sort of play it by ear. Where it's something which is ultra important, try and do both. If it's something which is relatively lightweight, not risk your business, I'd say a survey would do it as well. Like Recruiter ended up we had I think 40, 50,000 customers, later, and at this point the numbers are probably higher. So we had enough customers that we could survey them pretty regularly. So once you have a regular survey cadence, it becomes much easier. It's really in the beginning when you don't have that it's more challenging. Any last questions? There you go, yeah.
If you have a deeply bad UI/UX experience in an enterprise product, how have you tackled completely replatforming? And do you usually take most of that on in-house, or do you ever use third-party designers?
Yeah, it's a great question. So where possible, I try to do it in-house. So, and the reason for that is because your designers, your user researchers, over time, either they have or they should build the expertise around your domain. And it goes back to the user persona discussion we had just before this session, right? Which is, it's really important to know what a person at the host stand needs to do and really understand that. And if you give it to a third party, they just won't. So I'm not saying never use third parties, but in general, if you can do it in-house, I would. The question of doing big redesigns is a really interesting one. There is no immediate, straightforward answer to this. And I'll tell you why. Because you could take a UI and you could say, I'm going to completely redesign it. And then if it doesn't perform, it's really difficult to debug what happened, right? Was it the applets? Was it the look and feel? You don't know. You know, I remember there's a gentleman called Elliot Schmookler I talked to once in a while. He was at LinkedIn, and he later was at Wealthfront and Instacart. And we've had this discussion on whether these kinds of redesigns should be big bangs, or should they be, you know, like change one thing at a time and see what happens. My take now is probably leans a bit to the latter, that if I could, I'd try to do it one step at a time, because I have more control over what is being adversely affected. The problem is that if you started with a really bad UI as you described, you're sort of putting lipstick on a pig, right? I mean, it still looks terrible, slightly less terrible, and so it's not a great user experience. So there are times when you have to say, you know what, I'm going to cut bait and I'm going to make changes. In that case, obviously, the right thing to do would be to, you know, test it really, really carefully in certain regions, you know, of the world, or certain cities before you go all the way, because the impact on the metrics may be too large for the company to bear. But there are ways to do it for sure. Any final questions? One gentleman in the back. We're going to wrap up. I'm getting the hook, so let's ask a really long question. No, kidding.
Okay, I'll go very slowly. So you mentioned not to release too quickly to prevent kind of head spin and documentation drift and things like that. But as kind of the industry starts to lean towards faster deployment cadences and things like that, with some real values of decreasing the size of releases for debugging challenges, performance challenges, like how would you think about balancing both of those very real concerns?
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. It's a great question. I don't think there's a one size fits all. I think, once again, you know, the beta audiences, the 2, 5, 10, 25, 50% audiences, these are all ways to handle those things, I think, which is you don't have to, what I'm cautious about is going GA, right? When you go general availability with that thing every day, for instance, that may be too much, but you can do it with different audiences, and you can go to time periods much less than 2 months if you'd like. I don't think you should say you can't do it at all. But I think that I would still prioritize user impact, because at the end of the day, you know, if users don't use the product or find it frustrating, they have alternatives, right? And so the balance really has to be struck between what is the maximum amount of dislocation that any given your set of users is willing to accept, and how does that balance against the need to deploy quickly? And then even on that, I'd err a little bit on the side of the users being happy, but I completely hear you, because, you know, you don't want to build code and have it sitting on a shelf for months, for instance, and then, like you said, if you start having 3 or 4 releases, then how do you debug back to where things came from? So I'm not saying that that's not important. I would be careful to prioritize that above customer impact. That's the only takeaway. All right, well, thank you very much, folks. It was a pleasure, and please connect with me, and feel free to, you know, connect with me on LinkedIn, tweet on about the session, and hopefully we'll get a chance to talk later today. Thank you.